In a public address during Pesach in the year 1984, the Rabbi proposed that everyone study and complete in the course of the year the entire Rambam, the Mishnah Torah. And for those who for some reason couldn't do this, the Rebbe suggested a 3-year cycle, and then as a third option, to study and to complete in 1 year the Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvos, instead of the Mishnah Torah. The Rebbe's call evoked an overwhelming response from Jews all over the world. Tens of thousands have followed the schedule of study ever since. Every year. The response to the Rebbe's suggestion grew and triggered renewed interest into the life of this amazing Jewish personality, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. One of the towering figures in the history of the Jewish people. Only of him was it said that from Moshe Rabbeinu, until Moshe, the son of Maimon, there was none like Moshe. He is known as the Rambam, which is an acronym for his name, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, and universally, because his fame and influence transcended the Jewish community, he is called Maimonides, which is the Greek form of the son of Maimon. The Rambam was born on the 14th of Nisan, the day before Pesach, in the year 1135. He was born in Spain, in Cordova, a descendant of a scholarly, distinguished family, tracing its ancestry to Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi, who was the editor and the compiler of the Mishnah. And Rabbi Yehuda was able to trace his family all the way back to the house, the royal house of King David. At the conclusion of his commentary on the Mishnah, the Rambam enumerates his ancestry 8 generations back, indicating that all were distinguished dayanim, rabbis and scholars. His father served as dayan of the Jewish community of Cordova, and he was famous not only for his Torah knowledge, but also for his general scholarship, including mathematics and astronomy. Rabbi Maimon taught his prodigious son the Torah, the Talmud, and every aspect of Jewish religion and tradition, and provided him with a multifaceted education and a thorough training in all sciences. It was at the suggestion of his father that the Rambam immersed himself in the study of philosophy and medicine, 2 fields in which he later gained world fame. He was barely a bar mitzvah boy when the fanatical Muslims conquered Cordova in 1148. They tolerated no other religion than their own and offered the Jewish population the choice of conversion to Islam or death, or expulsion from their native land. The Jews were given the excruciating alternative to either surrendering their eternal faith, or their life, or abandoning their home, where they had lived for many centuries, leaving behind all their possessions, to seek haven in a hostile world where they were nowhere welcome. The vast majority of Jews, of course, among them the dayan and his family, chose exile and left Cordova. Of those who could not leave, many met a martyr's death, sanctifying the name of God, and some became insincere converts to Islam, merely outwardly, all the while in their hearts and in the privacy of their homes, observing and practicing all the mitzvahs of Torah, never abandoning their Yiddishkeit. Rabbi Maimon and his family wandered from city to city in southern Spain, without being able to stay in any one place for any long period of time, while the conquering Muslims swept all across southern Spain. After 10 years of a nomadic life, they joined a group of fugitives who headed toward North Africa and eventually settled in Fez, then the capital of Morocco, and that was in the year 1159. After a 5-year stay in Fez, they had to leave because of religious intolerance and persecution. Again, they became the wandering Jews without a home. They went through Yerushalayim and Hebron, and the Maimon family finally made it to Egypt. The Holy Land, which was desolate and unpopulated, ravaged by the Crusaders, did not afford any permanent place of residence. They spent 3 days in Yerushalayim in prayer at the Western Wall, one day in Hebron, praying at the graves of the Avos, of the patriarchs, at the cave of Machpelah, and from there they proceeded to Egypt. In Fostad, near Cairo, the seat of the caliphate, the family of Rabbi Maimon at last found a haven. Unlike other Muslim countries, the Jews of Egypt, under the tolerant and enlightened rule of the Caliph, were granted complete religious and civil freedom. They were allowed to develop their religious, cultural, and communal life as well as to engage in commerce without restriction or interference. It was here that Rabbi Moshe, the Rambam, created the master works for which the Jewish people are forever grateful to him. A few months after their arrival, Rabbi Maimon, the former Dayan of Cordova, passed away. Rabbi Moshe deeply mourned the loss of his great father, who was to him not only a father but also his primary teacher and most important influence. The younger brother, David, took upon himself the responsibility of providing financial support for the family in order to enable his gifted brother to devote himself to his studies without worry. David became a jewel merchant, importing gems and precious stones from India. He succeeded in this business, and the family lived a very comfortable life. Unfortunately, tragedy struck. On a business trip to India, the ship on which David was sailing was caught in a storm, shipwrecked in the Indian Ocean, and David died at sea. Moshe, the Rambam, now became the breadwinner of the family. But because of his study, his intense study, and grief over his brother's death, he became seriously ill. And for many months he was unable to support his family. When he finally recovered, he began to practice medicine. Rambam did not deem it proper to obtain monetary benefits or receive financial reward for his Torah knowledge. Torah should be studied only for the sake of heaven, and not to be used as a way or a means of a livelihood. And so he devoted himself to the vocation of medicine. He was so successful in his profession that in the course of time, because of his great reputation, the Grand Vizier and eventually Sultan Saladin appointed him to be their personal physician. Rambam made three major contributions to the field of Jewish law and Talmudic study through his literary works: commentary on the Mishnah, Sefer HaMitzvos, and Mishnah Torah. The earliest of these monumental works was his commentary on the Mishnah, also known as Sefer HaMo'er, the Luminary. He began this work at the age of 23 while on his way fleeing from Muslim persecution. He completed it 7 years later in Fostad. I was working on this commentary under the most arduous conditions, as we were driven from place to place, while traveling by land or crossing the sea. This is what he writes at the conclusion of his work. His clear, methodical, and analytical mind and his ability to arrange the material in an orderly fashion is evident in his early works. The commentary offers brief explanations for each Mishnah. These explanations are generally gleaned from the vast material and the lengthy discussions of the Talmud, and where no interpretation is found in the Talmud, Rambam gives those of his predecessors, the Ge'onim, or his own. Wherever necessary, he includes in his commentary scientific information, showing thereby that the sages of the Talmud were very versed in all spheres of secular knowledge. Besides its expository value, the commentary has an added asset for the practical application of the law. Rambam also composed an elaborate introduction to the commentary, in which he discusses various fundamental concepts of Jewish religion, such as prophecy, revelation, tradition, the development and the principles of the oral law, and so on. He also wrote individual introductions to all difficult sections of the Mishnah and to all complicated subjects treated in the Mishnah, clearly elucidating the principles underlying the laws and furnishing a concise summary of all the relevant halachic concepts. One of the most famous and significant of Rambam's introductions is his preface to the 10th chapter of the Gemara Sanhedrin, and there he formulates his famous 13 principles of faith. These fundamental principles have been incorporated into the davening, into the siddur of many Jewish communities, where it is recited at the beginning of the daily prayer of the Shachris, written in poetic form, and at the end of the davening in the form of the Ani Mamin. Also famous is Rambam's introduction to Pirkei Avos. Although it's only an introduction, and only a small part of his commentary on the Mishnah, nevertheless it is highly significant because of its treatment of the ethical principles. Popularly known as Shmeina Prakim, this essay has been translated into many languages. In it, Rambam offers a systematic presentation of the foundations of Jewish ethics. He discusses such basic Jewish concepts as the nature of the soul, the sickness and the cure of the soul, immortality, freedom of will, freedom of choice, divine knowledge, and similar topics that are touched upon in Pirkei Avos. His Talmudic genius is especially evident in his introduction and commentary to Seder Taharos, which comprises 12 volumes, 12 tractates of the most complicated laws of purity and impurity. Rambam's introduction and commentary succeed in making these intricate subjects of the Mishnah accessible and comprehensible. Had the Rambam written no other work but the commentary on the Mishnah, it would have been enough to immortalize him among the Jewish people. But as soon as he finished this work, he embarked on an even more ambitious project, and that is the codification of the entire work of Jewish law. In the words of Rambam himself in his introduction to the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam writes, "At this time, the sufferings of our people have increased. The pressing need of the moment overrides every other consideration. The wisdom of the wise has vanished. The wisdom of our learned men is concealed. Hence the commentaries of law and responsa of the Geonim, which they thought were easy to understand, have in our times become difficult to understand, and there are only a few individuals who are able to comprehend them properly. For this reason, I, Moshe ben Maimon the Sfardi, have girded my loins, and relying on the help of the Almighty, blessed be He, have thoroughly studied all their works, and decided to compile the results derived from them as to what is prohibited and what is unclean, and all of the laws of the Torah, all in clear language and concise style, so that the entire oral Torah will be systematically arranged for all. I will not quote the questions and answers, or the differences of opinion discussed, but only the laws themselves in a clear and succinct manner, in accordance with the conclusions derived from all these treatises and compilations existing since the time of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi until the present day, so that all the laws shall be accessible to young and old, whether they are biblical precepts or enactments by the sages or the prophets. In short, my purpose in composing the code is that no man shall have any need to resort to any other book on any matter of Jewish law, but that this work contain the entire oral law, including the ordinances, customs, and decrees instituted from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu to the redaction of the Talmud, and as expounded for us by the Geonim in all their works composed by them since the completion of the Talmud. I therefore call this work Mishnah Torah, for a man should first read the written Torah, and then read this code, and he will know from it the entire oral law, without the need of reading any other book in between. Before beginning the monumental task of codifying the whole range of halachic material contained in the biblical, Talmudic, and Gaonic literature, the Rambam composed another halachic work called Sefer HaMitzvos, the Book of the Commandments. It's a sort of an introduction to the Mishnah Torah, but it is also a valuable work in its own right, and is the second of his three major works on halacha, the other two being his commentary on Mishnah and the Mishnah Torah. The objective of Sefer HaMitzvos is to enumerate the 613 commandments contained in the Torah. The sages of the Talmud speak of 613 mitzvahs, which means 613 biblical commandments. These are subdivided into 248 positive precepts, mitzvahs aseh, 365 negative or prohibitory precepts, the mitzvahs lo aseh. A simple counting of the biblical laws yields a substantially larger number than 613. And nowhere in the Talmud is there a list enumerating these injunctions and prohibitions, nor an explicit formulation of the principles and rules on the basis of which biblical law could be counted. The Rambam divides his Sefer into two sections. The first is a profound exposition of the theoretical basis that guided him in determining which mitzvahs were to be included or excluded from the list of biblical mitzvahs. It presents and explains 14 rules and principles according to which the biblical injunctions and prohibitions should be counted. He establishes each of these principles and proves them with an abundance of evidence from the entire Talmudic literature. In the second section, the Rambam enumerates and defines the 613 commandments, which are in turn divided into 248 positive mitzvahs and 365 negative mitzvahs. This work, as all works of Rambam, has enjoyed great popularity throughout the ages, and many commentaries were written on this work. Currently, the standard edition of Sefer HaMitzvos is printed along with 7 commentaries. At the age of 32, Rambam began working on his Mishnah Torah. It took him 10 years, intensive, uninterrupted labor, before he completed this monumental work. It was an extraordinary feat to codify the vast material in the Talmud even in 10 years. It is told that when Rambam completed the work, his father, Rabbi Maimonides, and another man appeared to him in the dream. This is Moshe Rabbeinu, his father informed him. Rambam was awe-stricken. "I have come to see the work which you have written," Moshe Rabbeinu said. He examined the work and said, "Yasher koach," a work well done. The commentary on the Mishnah and the Sefer HaMitzvos, as well as other major and minor works, were written in Arabic. But the Mishnah Torah, Rambam's greatest work, he wrote in Hebrew, for it was meant not only for the Arabic-speaking Jews, it was designed to last beyond all transitory periods, or the stay of the Jewish people within Arabic culture. It was composed for all times, even for the days of Mashiach, and for all places. And for this, only the Holy Tongue would work. When he was requested to translate this work into Arabic, he expressed regret that he did not write his other works in Hebrew. He would prefer to have his Arabic writings rendered into Hebrew rather than the reverse. The Mishnah Torah is composed in lucid, well-styled Hebrew. Scholars of later generations have referred to the Rambam's Lashon HaZahav, a golden language, a golden style, a beautiful syntax, and above all a precise, unambiguous, clear style and language in where there is nothing superfluous or redundant. Rambam once said, "Had I been able to put the entire oral Torah in one chapter, I would not have used 2 chapters. His choice of words is so precise that many laws which are not mentioned explicitly in his code are deduced merely from the manner of his expressions. Unlike the earlier codifiers, who used the Talmud as the model for their halachic compendium, as far as language, structure, and organization of the law are concerned, Rambam used the Mishnah as the model for his, and the Mishnah is divided into Sidarim, orders, each order into tractates, each tractate into chapters, each chapter into halachic sections called Mishnayot. Similarly, Rambam divides Mishnah Torah into 14 books, each book into sections of related law, each section into chapters, and each chapter is divided into individual halacha. This is, of course, a more logical organization and methodical presentation, and makes it much easier to locate the specific topic of law which one may seek. Although Rambam gave his work the formal title Mishnah Torah, it also came to be known as Yad HaChazaka, the mighty hand, because of the divisions of the work into 14 books, which is Yud Dalid, the number 14, which is the word Yad. The uniqueness of Mishnah Torah, Yad HaChazaka, lies not only in its systematic arrangement, its lucid presentation, and stylistic beauty, but also in the scope of its content. The Mishnah Torah is the only complete code which contains all the biblical, Talmudic, and Gaonic legislation, including laws which cannot be observed in the time of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, and will again be observed after the coming of Mashiach. Thus, the Yad HaChazaka is valid for Jewish life in exile, as it will be in the times of Mashiach, when the people will once more be able to bring sacrifices in the Holy Temple, and the Sanhedrin will be restored, and herein lies one of the most significant values of Rambam. Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon was not only a leading Talmudic and halachic personality of his time, but also the chief exponent of Jewish religious philosophy. After concluding his Mishnah Torah, Rambam set out to present the religious philosophical view of Judaism. These he elaborated on in his masterly philosophical work called Moreh Nevuchim, Guide for the Perplexed. Here he deals comprehensively with Jewish doctrine and practice from a philosophical point of view. In this work, Rambam provides answers to the perennial questions for which the human mind always searches: the nature and existence of God, the purpose of creation, God's relationship to the universe, the meaning of life, human destiny, the origin and underlying reality of evil, free will, divine providence, divine justice, revelation, the purpose of the mitzvahs of the Torah, and the true way of worshiping God. In the countries under Islamic cultural influence, such as Egypt, where Rambam lived, where Greek philosophy captured the imagination of the intelligentsia, it became popular also in certain Jewish circles, and with the growing interest in the works of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, especially in its Arabic garb and formulation, there arose an apparent conflict between the views of secular philosophy and certain statements and ideas expressed in Torah and Talmud. For instance, how can God's absolute incorporeality and spirituality be reconciled with the human descriptions of him in the Talmud, in the Bible? The philosophically oriented Jews, while firmly committed to the principles and practices of Torah, were troubled and perplexed by the seeming contradiction between reason and faith. The Rambam, in his deep-felt concern for the spiritual well-being of his people, recognized the inherent danger to which such a situation might lead. This danger was especially acute among the less educated in Jewish religious thought, among whom the secular philosophy threatened to make serious inroads, and who, as a result of the apparent inconsistencies between reason and faith, began to waver in their religious commitments. Rambam, well versed in the teachings of the ancient and contemporary philosophers, felt himself compelled to compose a systematic presentation of the fundamental religious philosophical principles of Judaism, which would answer the questions which agitated the philosophically oriented intellectuals, to remove the doubts of the perplexed, and to enable them to continue Torah-true Judaism. My intention, says the Rambam in his introduction to the guide, is to expound biblical passages which have been doubted, questioned, and to elucidate their hidden and true meaning, which, when well understood, serve as a means to remove the doubts concerning anything taught in Scripture, and indeed many difficulties will disappear when that which I am about to explain is taken into consideration. Originally written in Arabic and titled Dala'at al-Khairin, no sooner had the work been completed than the author was besieged with requests from various centers of Jewish scholarship for copies of his latest work and for a Hebrew translation to benefit those unfamiliar with Arabic. Within a decade after its appearance, 2 Hebrew editions were made, one by Reb Shmuel ibn Tibbon and the other by Rabbi Yehuda al-Kharizi. Rabbi Tibbon's rendition had been accepted as the authoritative one because of its faithfulness in conveying the exact meaning of the author, with all of its nuances. Ibn Tibbon consulted Rambam through correspondence regarding the meaning or wording of all the difficult passages. Rambam himself gave the translation his approval, calling Ibn Tibbon the most able and fit person to discharge this task. The translation by al-Kharizi, although superior as far as beauty of language and elegance of style, was lacking in precision and exactness of meaning. Rabbi Avraham, Rambam's son, expressed dissatisfaction with al-Kharizi's translation because of its inaccuracies. Interest in this philosophical work was not limited to Jewish scholars, but was studied by thinkers of the non-Jewish world, Arabic and non-Arabic, Even in Rambam's lifetime, the book was translated into Arabic letters and used extensively by Mohammedan scholars. Not long afterwards, a Latin rendition of the Guide to the Perplexed appeared in Europe, followed by Spanish and Italian versions. At about the middle of the 19th century, interest in the work by non-Jewish philosophers was revived as a result of a new translation into French by Solomon Monk. Subsequently, it was translated into almost all European languages. The work wielded great influence on the scholastic philosophers of the Middle Ages and was extensively quoted by many of them, notably Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and Roger Bacon. Thus, Maimonides occupies a most prominent place in the annals of theological philosophy. The Moreh Nevuchim, Guide to the Perplexed, deals with difficult metaphysical concepts, and it became one of the most commented upon philosophical classics of its time. There are more than 30 commentaries on the guide, either in Hebrew by well-known authors, and many more by unknown authors. It's interesting to note that some of these commentaries include explanations from the Kabbalistic perspective, indicating that beneath the philosophical veneer of the Moreh Nevuchim lie Kabbalistic ideas, and by studying it only from the rational philosophical point of view, one does not appreciate the depths of its content. This is in accord with the view of those who hold that Rambam was not only a Talmudist and philosopher, but he was also a Kabbalist. During the past 200 years, it has been revealed in Chabad Lubavitch literature that he was also a mystic steeped in the study and traditions of Kabbalah. In fact, the source of some laws of his code of the Mishnah Torah can be found only in Kabbalistic literature, such as the Zohar. Rambam, through his monumental work, laid the foundation for all subsequent Jewish philosophical inquiry, known as the field of Chakira, and stimulated centuries of philosophical Jewish writing. As fame of the Moreh Nevuchim spread, the enthusiastic recognition of the work was countered by vehement opposition on the part of those opposed to the attitudes and principles of philosophy. Rambam reached the peak of his professional reputation as a doctor when he was appointed to the staff of the court of Saladin as royal physician. He was personally in charge of supervising the health of the Grand Vizier, as well as members of the royal family. He devoted himself wholeheartedly and tirelessly to his profession, and his fame as a conscientious, skilled, compassionate physician reached far and wide. His reputation spread to such an extent that King Richard the Lionhearted of England sought his medical services and offered him the position as his personal physician. Rambam declined the offer, preferring to remain in Egypt, where he had been appointed Nagid, or supreme head of Egyptian Jewry, employing his dignified position to protect his co-religionists throughout the Islamic world. Over 15 works on the theory and practice of medicine have been attributed to Rambam. Among these are a treatise on poisons and their antidotes, which was used throughout the Middle Ages. There was a discourse on asthma, a list of hygienic regulations, which would lead to a healthful life. His rabbinic works also are replete with references to medicine and its practice, and numerous rules for healthful physical well-being. There is an ancient physician's oath which articulates the physician's deeply felt obligation to heal the sick. Rambam, as a devoted doctor and guide for the perplexed, composed an oath for all physicians, Jewish and Gentile, which expresses the profound obligation of the physician to heal with devotion and humility, and it is a prayer for God's assistance and intervention. It reads as follows: O God, you have formed the body of man with infinite goodness. You have united in him innumerable forces, incessantly at work like so many instruments, as to preserve in its entirety this beautiful house containing the immortal soul. And these forces act with all the order, concord, and harmony imaginable. But if weakness or violent passion disturb this harmony, these forces act against one another, and the body returns to the dust from which it came. You send then to man your messengers, the diseases which announce the approach of danger, and bid him to prepare to overcome them. The eternal providence has appointed me to watch over the life and health of your creatures. May the love of my art actuate me at all times. May neither avarice nor miserliness, nor the thirst for glory or a great reputation engage my mind. For enemies of truth and philanthropy, they could easily deceive me and make me forget my lofty aim of doing good to your children. Endow me with strength of heart and mind so that both may be ready to serve the rich and the poor, the good and the wicked, friend and enemy, and that I may never see the patient as anything but a fellow creature in pain. If physicians more learned than I wish to counsel me, inspire me with confidence in and obedience toward the recognition of them, for the study of the science is great. It is not given to one alone to see all that others see. May I be moderate in everything except in the knowledge of this science. So far it is concerned, may I be insatiable. Grant me the strength and opportunity always to correct what I have acquired, always to extend its domain. For knowledge is boundless, and the spirit of man can also extend infinitely, daily, to enrich itself with new acquirements. Today he can discover his errors of yesterday, and tomorrow he may obtain new light on what he thinks himself sure of today. God, you have appointed me to watch over the life and death of your creatures. Here I am, ready for my vocation. The last years of his life were devoted to unceasing work as a physician, to revising and adding to his many writings. He was also the chief rabbi of Egypt, spiritual leader of the far-flung Jewish communities who sought his advice. The years of weariness took their toll, and he suffered from various ailments and weaknesses until on the 20th of Teves, in the year 1204, close to 70 years of age, he passed away and was mourned by Jewry the world over. In Fostad, both Jews and Muslims publicly mourned him for 3 days. In Jerusalem, special funeral services were held, and a general fast was declared. In the synagogues, the scriptural passages dealing with the penalties for transgressing God's commandments, and the narrative of the book of Shemuel describing the capture of the ark by the Philistines, which conclude with the verse, "The glory is departed from Israel, and the ark of God is taken," were read. He was interred in the holy city of Feria, where to this day thousands of Jews come to pray and meditate upon the life and teachings of this guide for the perplexed of all generations, of whom it is said, from Moshe to Moshe, there was none like Moshe.